Welcome to the Embodiment Matters podcast with me, Erin Giesemann Rabke, and my husband, Carl Rabke. Embodiment Matters is an ongoing, rich conversation about what it really means to be embodied and why and how embodiment matters so much in our daily lives and in our modern world. You can find out more about our wonderful guests, about our work. You can sign up for our newsletter and find out how to become a supporting member of our podcast online at embodimentmatters.com.
In this episode, we speak with Jeff Brown, and this was a really fun, lively conversation. Jeff is a teacher and a writer and a filmmaker. He's written book Soul Shaping and An Uncommon Bond, and then most recently, Grounded Spirituality. And so we talk a lot about what is grounded spirituality and the perspective of embodiment in that. And Jeff just has this really funny way of using language to poke holes in a lot of the blind spots that are happening around spiritual practice in these times, and particularly some of the guru-based traditions from the East. And, you know, as he jokes in the conversation, you don't have to throw the holy man out with the bathwater, but I think a lot of these considerations that he brings are really important. So we loved talking with Jeff. You can find out more about his work at soulshaping.com, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Welcome, Jeff Brown. We're so glad to be speaking with you today.
My pleasure. Happy to be with you.
So we love to start off these conversations with a question of what is embodiment? How did you?
Wow. I mean, there's a question. So for me, the way I would language that question internally is, so what does it mean to live an embodied moment or experience? And I think, for me, I use the term enrealment, which is kind of a bit of a kitschy term, play on enlightenment. But I think for me, it means experiencing all aspects or all threads of the human weave in the heart of the body itself. So not having a bifurcated consciousness, not being only accessing of certain particular threads, but experiencing all of it as a whole body experience. So that presence becomes about this whole body inclusive experience. I think that's what it means for me. And I think that I came to that on all kinds of different levels because I used to watch and witness myself experiencing this thing I was calling embodiment in a very fractured, fragmented, and sometimes dissociative way. So some aspect felt like it was coming into the body and other parts felt outside of my body. And so my work in this life, and I think in my creative life, is to try to language and to experience everything as part of the embodied experience.
In the chapter that you shared with us of your upcoming book, Grounded Spirituality, you wrote something that I think is really fascinating, and I have similar experience of this, about an armored body having more congested consciousness. How those go together. And it strikes me as how in so much of physical fitness industry, it's about growing an armored body. And, that dualistic mind controlling the body. And you also write something about, in your conversation with Michael, isn't that his name?
Yeah.
Yes, friend.
Yes.
About surrender versus control. And I wonder if you would just talk about that for a little bit.
So I think the way that I, in a very simple way, understand the human experience is, that there's two primary ways of moving through the world. And of course, there's gradations in between. But one is a survivalist consciousness, and one is what we might call a more authentic consciousness. And I think through a survivalist lens, the more armored the body is, the more efficient the body is at practical survival-based tasks, the more capable the body is of protecting itself from attack, of activating and energize in order to meet various survivalist goal sets. The more successful you are and the more capable you are of thriving within that system and that structure. So I was conditioned in that structure for all kinds of reasons, because that's the world I live in the West, and also because of my own male conditioning, and because being armored was the best way to not feel into the pain of my early life. Because the more armored the musculature was, the less access I had to all of the trapped feelings, wounds, and traumas that were buried below. And as my journey unfolded, and I think so much of my soul-shaping journey has been about coming to a more authentic consciousness, where I'm not just defining who I am by what puts food on the table and how I shield, protect, and perpetuate that. But my journey has really been about trying to find out who I really am and why am I here. And of course, for me, I found almost all of that in my body. I've never found much of anything outside of my body that was of any use to me on that quest. So I think that peeling away the levels of armor, which is the work I did with Al Lowen and bioenergetics, the work I did in holotropic, the work I did with deep massage and constant massage and so many levels, I was really interested in experiencing my body at this moment from an unarmored place or a less armored place. And of course, ultimately, that doesn't work as well, because then you can't function in the world that we live in. So, it's why I developed terms like conscious armoring, so that you put your armor on when you have to, and you also notice that it's time to take it off. And so for me, the authentic experience is one that requires us to go through stages of peeling away all the conditioning. And the conditioning is, of course, held in the musculature, because when the musculature is tight, when the body is constricted, when there's places that are enlivened and places that are cut off and closed off, my experience was I just wasn't here and present in the moment. It was quite simple, really. And when I would go and do bioenergetic work with Al Lowen and release all this holdings and tantrum and move all those feelings, I'd feel like I entered into a more unity consciousness experience, and I experienced all of that through and within the body itself. Yeah.
I love that you use the word a lot too of the mess, because it is messy. And, it's your beautiful phrase about waking down the body before we wake up awareness.
Sure. And I don't even know, I sort of adopted, we've all adopted these notions of what a language of awakening, transcendence or ascending, or, if you're a writer, channeling, or waking up. And I don't think I really had any problem with the up being awake. I'm a head tripper. I got a power of mind. So I don't think the issue was that. I really think waking down, which is a term that I came through my own languaging, but now I understand that Sanyal Bonder, I think, has a waking down movement. It just felt true to me that, and I felt that, and I've come to believe that this whole language of waking up is actually dangerous, and it continues to lead us away from an embodied experience, because what we need to do is get back into our feet, and to get back into our bodies and get in touch with the traumas and the holdings and move the material and come back to a real fluidity of experience within the body itself. And then we move outward into experience from a completely different vantage point.
Yeah, I love that image that Pema Chodron uses of, how often people will think of a spiritual practice being a staircase leading up out of the mess of their lives. When really, it's one down into the grit and like everything that we're avoiding.
Well, here we are, right? I mean, that's the whole patriarchal spiritual game, which is to tell us that something called enlightenment, which I don't believe exists, or something called an awakened state, not an awakening state, but an awakened state actually exists, happens independent of our selfhood, and independent of the body, and independent of the emotional body, and all of that's an illusion, and it's not really the truth, and it's just a story and a misidentification and illusion and all that nonsense. And I believe that happened because those men couldn't acknowledge the mess that they were, and couldn't egoically hold the reality that they were holding all kinds of confusion and not knowing and old pain material and unresolved relationships with their parents and various people in their lives. And so we created this construct about waking up independent of humanhood. And to me, that bifurcation is precisely what's destroying us, because if you really believe that you're going to find everything outside of the human story, you're not going to care what happens within the human story or what happens to the species or with the planet or anything, because you on some level believe none of that is real. And for me, I found that going deeper into the body, if you have the courage and the willingness and the support, which is important to be able to go back into that chaotic magnificence that is the body, and stay with it long enough to work your way through to a truly unified, not a silly or ridiculous or bullshit unity consciousness field that's outside of the body, but the one you experience within the sensations and perceptions of the body itself, that then you begin to understand that there's nothing to wake up to, that really it's just about getting here. And what is the bridge back to here? The bridge back to here has to be the body.
Yeah, I know you've written a lot about bypassing in spiritual practice, and I'm wondering, talk a little bit about, like, what would be some indicators that people are using a spiritual practice to bypass aspects of their life?
If they, I use the term the New Cage movement as well. So that's one strand of it. If they're partaking in what we could call New Cage notions of reality that clearly are an attempt to reframe uncomfortable parts of reality in ways that are more manageable. So some examples might be language like, everything is an illusion. It's all perfect. There are no victims. Everything that happens was meant to be. All judgments are bad. Suffering doesn't exist. You're responsible for everything that happens to you. Everything you see and feel is a reflection of you. All that stuff is what we could call, I think, spiritual bypassing language. And you'll also find it in the use of embodiment practices, including yoga, I think, for many people, in the view that they're going to somehow perfect this body in order to get away from the toxic body beasts. To me, that's also a spiritual bypassing practice, if that's the intention of the practice. And I think for many it is, and it was. If you look at core readings around the yogic movement, a lot of it has a very bypass-oriented quality to it. Mm-hmm. And, additionally, just basic notions, buying into spiritual teachings that talk about the self, what you identify the self as being necessarily unreal. And that feelings is an illusion, and your stories is necessarily untrue. And, for me, those are first level awakening processes where you begin to step out of your habitual framework of perception to see yourself through a different lens. That can be a wonderfully helpful and additive thing, so long as there's a blueprint to then go back down into the body and weave what we could call the transcendent experience with the immanent experience. If there's no blueprint to go back, and many spiritual teachers who are bypassers themselves don't want to provide it, wouldn't know how to provide it because they haven't lived it, then really all we end up doing is continuing to spiral outward and outward into this notion of the eternal emptiness called enlightenment, independent of the body. So anybody who's engaging in a practice that's defining spirituality as something outside of the human experience, to me, is fundamentally a spiritual bypasser, unless they're doing it for a limited time with a limited purpose to get another perspective to bring back into the body, and then I think it can be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that.
I think a lot of what's happening is what they're calling, what I would call a step one practice, they're calling step everything. And I think that's, many of the most popular spiritual teachers out there, in my view, aren't spiritual teachers, because I define spirituality as reality. So the one who's bringing us into the greatest number of threads of reality, including honoring of our humanhood and all of our stories and where we've been in this glorious body of ours, that's more of a spiritual teacher. Most of the people calling themselves spiritual teachers, for me, are just really bypassers. Mm. They're trauma survivors masquerading as masters of enlightenment. That's how I think.
Yeah. So I'm curious about, we have endless late night conversations with some of our dear friends who've been in, patriarchal spiritual traditions and had some good unfolding by, rigorous training in those traditions. And then we're at this point now of really seeing through the, layers of bullshit and exactly what you're describing. And then I was just having a conversation with my friend Diane Hamilton about this, about what's the balance of, having someone in a position of authority in the Feldenkrais work. That's part of what we do. It's so much about reclaiming your own inner authority, reappropriating that.
Yeah.
And finding a relationship with someone or a practice where you can let yourself go to uncomfortable edges. I don't know if I'm saying this clearly, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I hear you.
How do we carry the goodness of traditions forward without being so soft that we throw the baby and the bathwater away, but also sort of extract as best we can some of those layers of patriarchal bullshit that really are not serving, you know?
I said in my film Carmageddon, I don't know if you've seen that film, but maybe I should send it to you, because we deal with this question of not throwing out the holy man with the bathwater.
The holy man with the bathwater.
And it's, you know, in that case, it's a film about me and my experiences with Bhagavan Das. So that was a wonderful opportunity for me to learn about and inquire into all of these things, and in a very lived way. And so I guess for me, the body has to be the answer, you know, the intuitive body, the knowing body, the sensing body. And this is the problem. We're not in touch with it. So, because I think when I was in touch with it and I would sit before various teachers or masters or dialogue with Ram Dass or anybody, if I was in touch with the intuitive body seemed to know when the message was supporting my journey of self-creation, and when it was leading me away from something that, you know, that felt like a healthy selfhood. And so I think that the teachers who really practice and embody and honor the idea that they don't know your path, I mean, that's, if somebody starts telling you what your path is, I think you should just immediately leave the room. So that's one very simple and obvious and not very subtle measure of, you know, what spiritual teacher to cozy up to and what not to. And you know, I mean, I know it's problematic for me to say that I think people should just cherry pick and just go in for and learn and integrate whatever it is, because they're just being reminded of something on some level they intrinsically probably know anyway. I don't think you're really learning much of anything. You're being led to something that is, I believe, held as a deep knowing. Yeah. And that's what worked for me. I never got stuck anywhere for very long but I also appreciate a lot of people don't have that intuitive knowing. They don't know when to stop. And maybe they do benefit from cozying up to one particular teacher for a very, very long time. But I think, you know, if you're doing a spiritual practice with a teacher that doesn't include an embodied component to it, you're more likely to be led astray. Because if you're not in touch with your body, if you're not centered in your body, you're not really ever going to know what's true. And you're going to get caught into the God-jectification process, which is so much of why there's a problem in the spiritual world. Because we're projecting onto people that they know everything and that they're totally realized, which is false and untrue, not even possible at this stage of human development. That's a big lie. If they say they're realized, if they claim they're enlightened, if they say they're finally absolutely awakened, then I don't think you should sit before them, because that's a blatant lie. Nobody at this stage of human development has found a way, or as at a stage where they can hold and manage all threads. If there is a God, we are not that God yet. You know, most of us are operating on the tiniest fragment of possibility within our consciousness. So, but if they say, listen, I found a little something, but God knows I don't know everything, and they don't just say that to hook you in, but you feel that they really believe that, then there might be something there to sit with.
Right.
Yeah.
So your body tells you that you've had enough and you're ready to move on. I mean, you know, I think at some point we have to take over our own process. And hopefully, ideally, we're always controlling our own process, but sometimes we do have to surrender to something. And but we have to always be aware that at some point it has to be and must be time to move on. And that if we're staying there for too long, it's probably an indication that we're not actually in a growthful state.
Yeah, I have a friend and colleague who's a Ralpher and a meditation teacher, and he had this great line where he said, I don't trust someone who hasn't sat with lineage, and I don't trust someone who's only sat with lineage.
Yeah, right.
That edge of like, how do you stay with something long enough to cook our defenses, but also to maintain that kind of freedom and like a living edge that's responsive to these particular times in this particular life.
And I'm not so sure about, you know, and I talk about that a bit in Grounded Spirituality in the dialogues with Michael. I'm not so sure about lineage because, you know, when I pick up most of those Eastern spirituality books written by men, they're basically all saying the exact same thing. It's the same bullshit framework of perception about the more realized being in the meditation cave, independent of the village, the people in the village being substandard, you know, serving the milk. I mean, it's this whole that threads through the entire lineage. And so I'm actually not sure that We should be following anybody who's connected to those lineages. I mean, you can dabble in it a little bit, but I think it really is time, not just because the species is at risk, for sure the species is at risk, but because I think on an evolutionary level, we're moving towards more inclusive consciousness. And I think it's time for us to develop new lineages. And I have a call to action at the end of the book. And I really want to encourage young people to take these ideas and to deconstruct, question, constructively criticize every single notion of lineage. Do not ever bow before it because it's lineage. Ask yourself very simple questions. Is this true? Does this feel true to my experience? Is this something that's going to serve us as a humanity, or is this going to bifurcate us and distance us from any elements of reality? And I think if they ask that question with most of what we call lineage, they're going to come to the conclusion that most of it is leading them away from the inclusive consciousness that's the only thing that can serve us at this stage. So what often they call non-duality isn't non-duality. It isn't a unified field because there's no self, there's no body, there's no story. The emotions are illusion. Everything about our humanness is removed from this ridiculous, nonsensical version of unity consciousness. We're going to talk about real unity consciousness. We need a whole new lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's saying a lot. And it's not something I wanted to say. I love the idea that there was a lineage for me to bow before and to lean into. And I've just never really found one. You know, I mean, the closest thing I ever found to a spiritual lineage was somatic psychotherapy, because it was the only modality that seemed to bring me into my body, into the everything. You know, working with Alexander, and I say this in the book, Alexander Lowen, for me, the founder of bioenergetics, was a great spiritual teacher because he brought me back into what he called the spirited body. And most sanghas and most spiritual practices are on some level or another seem to be pulling people away from that entirety, the experience.
So I have to ask you about, do I want to go here? Do I not want to go here? But I'm just going to go for it because I think we'll have a...
Let's do it. Let's go for it.
So I used to practice and teach yoga, asana, and quit teaching about 15 years ago, just seeing where what my culture was doing to that practice. And it just felt really like, oh God, no, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And love the semi-obscure Feldenkrais work that's very much about non-objectifying relationship with the body. And it's not about having a perfect butt. And, you know, it's very hard to have a, what do I want to say? Our attempts to parade around as if we're perfect are just transparent from the somatic perspective, because you just see that that's what you're doing, right? So, and so in the chapter that I read from your book about, I don't know if this is humor, I can tell you have a great sense of humor, and I don't know if you're serious or not serious about barking dog yoga.
Yeah, sure. Rough. I mean, it's obviously I'm playing with the notion of downward dog and trying to create an impression or an image of a yoga that allows for emotional expression or release. But so I'm being playful, but I'm also being deeply serious at the same time.
So, well, I guess my question is really about like, you know, because I just recently saw there's a online conference happening about cultural appropriation and how to be sensitive to that with yoga. And my experience is also that in that tradition, you know, whatever happened with Krishnamurti and then the teaching and lineages that came from him of Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois and Desikachar and all of that, it seems very recent to connect any kind of physical practice with the Yoga Sutras, for example, or these texts. Like, we're so, as modern people, kind of grasping at straws to try to make that a coherent practice. So my question is like, does it have to be called a yoga? Like, I loved what you were describing, having a physical practice, and maybe it just doesn't have anything to do with yoga. Maybe it's...
I absolutely think that it's time for new language. I mean, I play and lean into new language, and I think we need a lot more new language because, you know, just the very notion of yoga as meaning yoga or unity to me is preposterous, because so much of the early and lineage-based yoga traditions, in my view and in my experience, are really not pulling us into a unified field, because they're trying to pull us towards some perfected notion of the body in order to pull us up and away from, again, the messy, toxic body beast. So it's you know, just because someone says they're in the now doesn't mean they're in the now. If they're saying it a lot, they're probably not even close to the now. And if somebody talks about unity repeatedly or integrity constantly, then immediately have to ask yourself if they are unified and if they have any integrity. That's been my experience with the spiritual world, that it's just mostly a load of bullshit and people talking. And if you believe them, then they can believe their story that they've made up about themselves. So for me to create something we have called yoga and to now find new language for it so that we really do create a physical practice with something we no longer call the asana, but we'll call something else, that is actually a more integrative experience. So we're not on the mat trying to be, I mean, that whole notion of becoming the sort of the egoically perfect, masterful being or whatever, that really has its roots in what yoga was intended to be in the beginning. And of course, also has roots in the unhealthily egoic nature of Western life. So they come together, I think. But it's time for a practice that's, about going into the body and going into the mess through the practice, not to become the perfect asana practitioner, but to become someone who's actually truly bridged back to the moment through an deepened experience of the body. And I'm all for creating new language. So barking dog yoga is just an idea of crafting a yoga, and it's not the perfect term for a model that would be one of the great limbs of the yoga tree, but it's just a suggestion that it's time to craft something that incorporates, even in a classroom environment, the excavation of the emotional material, the excavation of the unexpressed screams, howls, and tears, and to find a way to practice and utilize the mat so that at the end of it, you don't just sort of feel stronger and you don't just feel more open, you actually feel also more healed on an emotional level. To me, that's the next stage for this thing we've been calling yoga.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love talking about new language. And so far I heard you say, new cage.
Yeah, you have a
instead of new age. Let's talk. What's some more fresh language that's emerging from your corner of the field?
So I mean, I use the term truth aches. I've used that for years. That came through my writing of Soul Shaping. Truth aches were any indication, any symptom, sign, hint, or whisper that you're off path, that you're not following your true path. So, and I think truth aches is an important way of thinking about it. So you begin to understand yourself in terms of, how is my depression? How is this malaise? How is my resistance to this choice of partner or choice of job really a truth ache? And how is that showing up in my life?
Brilliant. Yeah.
So, a new cage for me was just sort of an obvious word reframe. That wasn't a very hard one because it just felt like a prison to me, So what really got it happening for me so I was kind of writing, I was writing honestly, but there were things I wasn't saying about how I felt about what we could call the ungrounded spiritual world, and various well-regarded teachings and some of the Oprah's teachers. And I just didn't buy any of it as something that was, I got that it was serving their economic and egoic purposes, but I didn't think it was necessarily serving humanity. And so, but I was careful because, I had an agent, and it was just, I was leaning into what does it mean to be in this profession. And ultimately, someone I knew on Facebook had left her therapist and had got hooked into new cage practices, and then hung herself when her stuff arose in the middle of the night too frequently. And she no longer took seriously the whole notion that her feelings were real and that therapeutic practice or process was necessary. And so she died. And that seemed to be the thing that tipped me in the direction of my spiritual activism and bringing my voice. True that I had a dream, and this part of me said, stop it, fire that agent, and stop schmoozing, and stop sending to Oprah, and just tell the truth. Are you for the profession or the people? You're here for the people, and you're here to honor your voice. So stop this. So it was a very important moment for me. So then I started to write about New Cage. And I remember I put up a post, I think it was March or February 2013. And that page had only been like a few hundred people a week were joining. Now I was getting 2,000 to 3,000 a week were joining the page. So it was kind of a very good learning about, when I go to that edge, it turns out for me that actually there are people who are resonating with it, and it actually grows things, which is something I never would have expected. There's a whole giant cadre of people who've been part of this new cage stuff and part of ungrounded spirituality and have been saying things under their breath. And for some reason, we've all been taught in the spiritual world, we're not allowed to talk about these things. In every other part of society, we're allowed to challenge, question, deconstruct, constructively criticize. We get that. But in the spiritual world, part of the patriarchal conditioning is that you're not allowed to be angry. You're not allowed to gossip. You're not allowed to tell the truth. You're not allowed to challenge the guru. You're not allowed to. It's so deep, even in my own bones, I was afraid to tell. And I'm a lawyer. I know I can say what I feel and think. It's personal expression, it's freedom of it's completely acceptable. And I'm still deconstruct this part of me that thinks it's not okay to say these things. And so I started to say these things, and now as grounded spirituality comes out and it's being met with a strong response, I understand that what I've been saying is something that needed to be said. It was hard to say it then. It's a lot easier to say it now because now more people are saying it. But so I think in the overarching sense of it, the most important thing with all of this now is to start speaking from our most deeply embodied experience and where the truth resides, and to speak that truth outward and to speak this truth to power. You know, it's time for a Shri 2 movement, right? It's time to start calling out any unconscionable gurus. They're not all unconscionable, but it's time to really get this on the table and really begin to understand how we have been controlled and prevented from the authenticity that is the true spiritual experience by all of these very manipulated constructs.
So for imagining somebody's listening to this who maybe this is rattling the nice cage a little bit, you know, like, what would you invite? Like, what's an invitation someone could take away of how to embody what we're talking about in their life right now?
Well, I think the overwhelming nature of the culture, the way in which the unconscious media and marketing constructs have just got us, and these phones have gotten us so flooded and overwhelmed, I think we have to practice and develop the art of what I call solitude. You have to find a way to pull up and out of this overwhelm of stimulation and reconnect. It was a lot easier when I started to do this work 20 years ago or 30 years ago. To begin to really start to remember what it's like, or to begin to know for the first time what it's like to feel a connection to your embodied self, and to begin to hear the voices that are coming through it. The intuitive voices, the voices of knowing, that which isn't comfortable for you as a way of being in the world, all of that. If we don't slow down and create that space, how are we ever going to even begin to do the work of embodiment? We're not. Because the whole culture, the unconscionable part of the culture, consumerism preys on the uncentered. So they want you uncentered. The whole system wants you uncentered and disembodied, because then you're going to constantly make money for them and spend more money on things you don't need, right? So I think solitude's important, but I also think doing somatic emotional release work is unbelievably essential. Having people do embodiment practices, trying to get into their bodies without clearing the emotional debris that they're holding, the rage, the grief, the shame, all of the material, the trauma, the screams. You know, Andrew Harvey wrote the foreword for the book, and he said, if I could just read very quickly from this, because I think that what Andrew said was, so in this book, so forget what he's saying about me part, because I don't always agree with that, but you will find someone who truly understands that the divinization of the body is the key to the birth of a human race that can respond from the fullness of itself to the problems now erupting everywhere. What he understands is that this birth of the divine in the body is the hardest path of all, because in order to take this path, we have to unlearn all of the religious and mystical messages we have been given about the illusory nature of the body, the sinfulness of the body, the ignorance and illusion steeped in the body. And then he goes on to say, the second reason that it's difficult to re-enter the body is that you have to confront all of the trauma, karmic terror, grief, and deep suffering that your body has stored over your lifetime. This is part of the reason why so many people are refugees from the body, and why so many people embrace transcendental philosophies that deny the body. The work of actually going down into the body to listen to the screams that have been suppressed by our wounds that are hidden within the body is a devastating process, necessary, but painful, and very, very demanding. So I learned this with Aloe, and if I didn't go down and tantrum and rage and squeeze the red towel that was my mother's neck in this symbology and somatic experience, I couldn't have moved on to the next stage of my journey, which ultimately led me to being free enough within myself to find my calling to write. Both because you need to create space inside for your calling and true path and sacred purpose to reveal itself, and if you're bunked up emotionally, you can't. And because there's so much transformation happens in the maturation, I make no distinction between spiritual and emotional maturation. So the more work you do with the emotional body, which means going into the physical body, the greater chance you have of standing in your wholeness as a matured spiritual being. So the second stage of Heartful Solitude is you really, I believe, have to do deep somatic work to move this material through you so you can transform, and so you have space inside to move forward with energy and hopefulness to the next stage of your journey.
Yeah, it's deep work.
Yeah, I'd love if it wasn't, but it never seemed to get me very far when I was trying to do it in a more softer or more superficial way.
Mhm.
That's not what it looks like, on the cover of Time magazine and Mindfulness magazine. It looks so peaceful and.
I think we're full of mind enough. I think it's time for some heartfulness magazines.
Yeah, very much.
I mean, the notion of mindfulness, it's wonderful, but it's also a term that it has a represented feeling to it. What does it mean to be a mindful being? To me, it's very different from what it feels like to be a heartful being. And we really need to look at and question every single word we're using when we're talking about this thing called spirituality, because maybe all of it is actually the thing that's imprisoning us in a way of being that's not serving us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so many of those terms, like
monkey mind. So all of a sudden you play this patriarchal game of thinking the whole problem is your mind. Your mind keeps bouncing from this to this. My experience was that it's actually really much more about the monkey heart, the monkey mind, because the more I moved the material emotionally, the more my mind calmed down. So I went down to go up.
Mm-hmm.
I found that when I stayed in the mind practicing, sure, you can perpetually meditate and get in like a drug-addicted meditative 3-hour stupor every day and tell yourself that you're healed till you get in a relationship and you're still crazy. But if you actually want to have a real spiritual practice, go down into the body, clear the emotional debris, get in touch with your feelings, honor your feelings, and let the material move. And I guarantee you, if you do enough of that, your mind will calm right down and there will no longer be much of a monkey mind.
Yeah, I have that experience also.
Yeah, so it's a big lie. And you get why they told this lie, because they can control you, because it's a bullshit practice that will never transform you. And if you never transform, you're controllable, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
once you actually transform, you look at them and go, I don't need you anymore. So there's economic benefits,
right.
egoic benefits. And also because it reflects what they're doing to avoid their material. All these dudes are avoiding their stuff. So they create this notion of monkey mind because they themselves want to just spend their lives bouncing back and forth and calming through meditative practices and all the rest of it, the mind. And of course, then they have to pull out a relationship because when they're in a relationship, they realize that nothing's actually changed. And so this is it's a whole system that's using language of mindfulness and monkey mindness and, and mastery. I mean, all of it is masturbation. You're not mastering anything. I mean, I'd rather be a jack of all trades and a master of none than a master of one thing and not able to integrate or connect to anything else.
Wait, I need to pause with that for a minute.
Yeah.
That is amazing.
I wrote about it because so what happened is I was a young guy, I left law, I worked for Ed Greenspan, I had a whole thing, I was about to be a prominent lawyer. I went to Mexico at some point and there was this kind of really sort of like a white guy, 50 years old, like an executive, and he'd succeeded in that system, right? And he was asking me, what do you want to do? I said, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not sure. And he said, oh God, a jack of all trades, master of none. We don't need any more of those, right? It was a very important moment for me. And as a male conditioned warrior, I was like, yeah, I'm into mastery. I'm going to be the greatest lawyer ever. I'm going to be the greatest, blah, 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 blah. Even if it means I don't develop 500 other aspects of myself, I am going to be great at that one thing and make a lot of money. But over time, I realized that he was exactly what I didn't want to become. I didn't want to be the master of one thread of consciousness, singular thread of consciousness, perfected master who was underdeveloped in every other part of my life, as many so-called spiritual teachers are. I wanted to be able to be here for all of it to the extent possible, which means really learning how to develop in a lot of different directions and finding all those threads come together in like a holy weave that was indistinguishable in a way. And that's my calling in this lifetime, to try to do some of that. And so be a jack of all trades, master of none feels a whole lot better to me than being just a masturbation addict, which is essentially what they are, right? It's no substitute for the real thing, boys,
Right.
Yeah.
It reminds me of I think a few years ago, Sounds True was doing this interview series about waking up. I don't know if you remember that. They had 40 spiritual teachers who were...
40 so-called spiritual teachers, yeah.
Spiritual teachers who Tammy was interviewing about this idea, and it was so interesting to me. I was listening to a lot of them at the time to just notice my internal bullshit detector and just what you're talking about, because the ones who would say it just gets better and better and happier and happier. And I was thinking to myself, like, let's talk to your girlfriend and see.
What planet are those liars on, right?
And the ones who would find, like, a teacher who would say, like, for me, the real joy is in discovering my own bullshit in relationship. And I would have this sigh of relief of, like,
it was when they brought
what it's
grit,
about.
rather than after my spontaneous awakening, everything became
shiny and happy and perfect. It's just such a relief to let go of that.
And now that the trend is moving towards grounded spirituality, and I know many authors and teachers who are copying and imitating other authors and teachers, I won't get into any names, but you don't even know if they're telling the truth or if they just think that's the way to attract followers. So for me, it's very simple. If someone tells me they're a spiritual teacher, I already know they're a fraud. It's not complicated for me. You're not a spiritual teacher unless you're defining spiritual. Now, if you can call yourself a meditation teacher, you can talk about what you've perfected and say that's what you teach. But don't tell me you're a teacher of this whole spiritual realm, because for me, spirituality is reality. And nobody is absolutely the great teacher of all aspects of reality. It's simply not possible at this stage of human development. So the big lie is I'm a spiritual teacher. You're not a spiritual teacher. You may just be able to teach a particular thread of the weave in an effective way, and that's fine to say that.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is the real honest answer. And I get it's a marketing construct. This is branding. I mean, you really have to look closely at what is motivating the so-called spiritual teacher. Is it that they really have some great, brilliant wisdom to impart that's going to change your life? Or are they really just trying to position themselves in order to make a living doing what it is they're doing, or to get a certain kind of egoic gratification that they get from being held in high regard, which usually means they're using that as an opportunity to no longer have to deal with their own shadow.
Right.
So I don't want to, I'm not trying to be a cynic arbitrarily. I just simply think it's all bullshit. And I think the new generations and the younger generations who are so much savvier in many ways than we were, and their bullshit mongers are set way, way higher. Yeah. The direction to go is to develop a new idea of what it means to be spiritual, and to get out of the unhealthily egoic identification with enlightenment and I'm a teacher and all of that stuff, and just start asking the question, what does it really mean to be here? And how do we develop practices that bring us back into our fullness of body and beingness so we can have the most integrated experience of this life?
Mm-hmm. So will you connect that for a moment with, we sort of nodded at this earlier, but the state of the world and, the species at risk. And
yes,
there's something that has been, pushing on me, niggling me in the past years of I'm so not interested in just helping people on their self-improvement project if it doesn't somehow connect with the world and the state we're in.
Absolutely. So, what I came to realize is, as I was proceeding with my understanding of things, is that this sort of, singular threaded notion of enlightenment or spirituality, that these characters were no different than Trump for me. Because in a way, this notion of perfection, this emphasis on mastery, this kind of self-centered anti-self in a way, right? And particularly in the spiritual world, I mean, they're incredibly self-centered, but yet they're bashing the self. How fucked up is that, right?
Yeah.
Talk about people who are confused about what they're talking about. So all of it seems to me, led me away from the relational nature of the human experience, that, a wholeness experience, an enrealed experience, an embodied experience. Sure, I may have to do work within the singular self in order to transform it so I could be more present. But once I get there, I naturally find that I have a relational nature. And I stop looking vertically upwards. So that's why up is a problem. And I start looking horizontally, and I start looking downward for the entirety of life experience. And I think that's why we need to redefine spirituality, because if we keep defining it the way we have, nothing's going to change on a species-wide level. The more people become spiritual, the more they're going to be telling themselves nothing that is in their human experience is true, and nothing that's happening outside of us is true. It's all an illusion after all, and the real life exists outside of that in the eternal emptiness floating up and above the human fray or something. So I think that for me, the longer I've proceeded after doing a lot of individualized work, I then have moved into the need, and that's what writing's partly about, to be more relational with whatever the offering is. and then to move essentially and eventually into some form of sacred activism. So we are all finding our callings, living our path, and realizing it has a relational quality to it. We don't need any more characters sitting in meditation caves praying for the well-being of the village. We need action, we need connection, and we need people to get on fire with path and purpose. So in the second part of the book, there's a 12-chapter dialogue with Michael. The chapter I sent you is part of part 2, which is called Here. Because my work in that part of the book is to try to get him here. He's got to get here first. And that means he's got to go back into the screams of the body. After we kind of get him more here, and then he goes, okay, Jeff, so I'm kind of more here, but like, why am I here? Like, it's so painful, it's so difficult. So the last part of the book is called Why, and it's really about sacred purpose. Because once I got more into my body, my purpose revealed itself and unfolded as an encoded truth that lived within the body. I couldn't find it in the mind. I couldn't find it by asking anybody else. All of it lived inside of these bones. The more I enlivened these bones, the more information I got as to directionality. And sacred purpose almost always, one form or another, has a relational quality to it because we are fundamentally relational beings. So we need practices, and we need a model that gets people here and then has them mind that body in order to excavate and get answers as to why they're here. And I think if we keep trying to find, a lot of people in the field to write about enlightenment and purpose, but their practices all are disembodied. So you can't find your purpose in the amorphous emptiness. You'll only find your individuated purpose within the body itself. And that's why your work and this conversation really, really matters. Because if we can't get here in our bodies, we're never going to change anything.
Mm-hmm. It's beautiful. I'm with you. I'm with you.
Well, unless somebody's got some other story to tell me, and I'm open to hearing it, but this is the only thing that makes any sense to me. I really honor individual paths. So when I hear practices that talk about the self not being real, your story always not being real. I mean, I understand we have some misidentifications and misunderstandings and misconstructions of story, but to act like all of it isn't real, and there are practice teachers with great fame out there who are doing this. We know about them. Mm-hmm. Story's not real, self's not real, feelings aren't real, it's all illusory. Those people are, I think they should be imprisoned for what they're doing. I think this is heinous, horrifying, because to tell me that everything about my selfhood, all the information I gathered from this body as to who I am and why I'm here, all of the love that I got from my bubi and my zeta that is stored within my body, all the efforts those selves made in order to bring Jeffrey through strong and ready to go out into the world and do what he had to do, that none of that is real to me is like a hallucination and is absolutely and utterly insane. And I see so much extraordinariness in the self. I see so much possibility in every human I ever encounter, even those who are trapped in the shadow realms, right?
Yeah.
We don't want a spirituality that doesn't integrate with the selfhood and honoring of it. This bifurcation between spirituality and humanness is what's destroying us.
Yeah.
We need to bring together so that no longer the guru can say, well, yes, I hit on your girlfriend and yours, but that wasn't really me. That was just my personality. That is the most manipulative load of bullshit I've ever heard in my life. Mm-hmm. If you can't live up to the same standard with respect to your selfhood that you're trying to get people to live up to with respect to this thing you're calling spirituality, then to me, you're just lying to people. We have to integrate all of it. And that integration is what makes us aware of what's happening around us. And then we get eager to get out there and do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it seems that it's really kind of the only possibility out of this situation we're in on the planet.
I think so too.
Sacred purpose and be on fire about it.
If we don't get into our bodies, we're doomed. It's just that simple.
I want to ask you about one other phrase you use that I really like, and I really have an experience of this. And I remember, probably 20 years ago when Carl and I were visiting his parents, and we were in Manhattan and walking around. And I had been doing Tai Chi and yoga and was trying to work with, getting in my body before I retired from my yoga practice, which I found was bifurcating. I was treating my body like an object. Right. Anyway, at that time, I was walking down the street and I felt someone walk by who had such hara, grounded gravity in their presence. It was like stunning to me to notice and feel that. And now it's something to some degree, at least in a beginning way, I've grown in my own self, and I really
that was me walking by.
Listen. Now it would be you, but then it was not you.
I thought it was David Bowie, but
well, you use this phrase about embodied human beings have gravity, and I have such an experience of that, and I feel like because I have some amount of that in myself, I can feel its presence or absence in other people too. Yeah. And I love it. I think it's important for us to have some gravity. I'd love if you would just talk about that for a minute.
Well, I think that, this whole thing about feeling your feet, and being in your feet, mm-hmm. and being, rooted and grounded to the earth on some level is what we're talking about. And it is striking when you connect with someone or walks past you who you feel is actually here.
Right.
Here-ness begins with the ground, with their connection to the earth itself. And there is a gravity about that. And it's sad to say that it's a striking thing. The fact that you noticed that and it was so striking for you was helpful, but it also says a lot about how seldom you encounter them. Yeah, right?
That's true.
So I think that was low, when you worked with Al Lowen, the first thing he did, and it's the first exercise in the book, there's a number of exercises in the book, and the first one was just his bioenergetic grounding practice. And because if I couldn't feel my feet and allow the feelings to come up that arose when I felt vibration moving from my feet upward, then I really wasn't here. And so therefore, everything after that, from that fractured state, was a reflection of that fracturedness. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why grounding practices on an emotional level, even Osho's dynamic meditation is very helpful for people. Holotropic breath work, because it gets you into your breath and you're on the ground and you're moving through the body and from the body. That was an incredibly valuable practice for me. And because I wanted to have a feeling of having gravity. So I remember after doing this 8-day thing with Stan Groff and Cornfield's meditation stuff did nothing for me, except after I would do a breath work, and then I felt like I didn't need to sit that way. I was naturally meditative because I moved back into my body and cleared my debris. And after one particular one where I threw the assistants off me for an hour and a half, it was a wildly somatic experience of throwing my mother off my back energetically. I went out and sat before this field of bulrushes at the Governor Dummer Academy in Massachusetts. It was perfect because I was trying to get dumber and not to be so bloody smart. And I sat before these bulrushes and I felt completely at one with them. Whereas before the breath work, I sat before the bulrushes and felt completely bifurcated and disconnected and somewhat dissociative and just part of the human world and in the way that we've operated. And so I think what changed and why I had an experience of myself having gravity afterwards was because I did an hour and a half of releasing everything that was in the way of my getting back into my feet and my body.
Right.
Yeah, and I love that you chose that image for the cover of your book, just your leg and foot on this earth.
Now, how do you know that's my leg, Carl? How do you know that's mine?
Is it?
Yes. I'm a real narcissist when it comes to my legs.
Well, it's a great leg, and it's a great that's where we need to be, is on this spot in this life, in this world.
Yeah.
Here we are, nobody ever said it was going to be easier. I think what's happened for me, or that no one ever said it was going to be easy. I think what's happened, my experience is the farther I go and when I can go farther into this journey, I don't find that it's always easy. My path is hard. Writing is hard. It's a hard path. My purpose is a hard path. You're not always going to have a blissful experience. It's not like that. The economic world's not like that. And it can just be, you may have a very hard calling. But what you do have then is the satisfaction that knowing that you're really here to the extent that you can be, and that you're here doing what it is you're meant to do. And that doesn't mean it's easy, but there is a deep, deep satisfaction from being present for what's truly encoded within you in your life that is worth all the years and years of effort. Because I always felt like if I had an hour of that in my life, I'd be better off than most, and I'll work for that all my life to get to that hour. And, and if you're lucky, you'll get more than an hour,
Right. Mm. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That feels like a good closing place, and I'm so happy to have talked with you.
Mm-hmm. happy to be connected, excited to read your book, and now we have to watch Carmageddon.
Yes, but whatever you do, wear a tinfoil hat while viewing.
Okay, it's good to know in advance.
Trust me.
Well, thank you so much. I hope we can do this again.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You're both great.
Thanks, Jeff.
Take care.
Hey.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you enjoy this podcast, it's great if you want to share it with friends or post about it on social media. Also, you could make a donation to support the podcast or find out more information about our classes and offerings at our website, embodimentmatters.com.